Good morning and welcome to the Cradle-to-Career Ad Hoc Committee for the Executive Director Review. My name is Robert Tagorda, and I'm chairing this committee. Today marks our first committee meeting, which will be run according to the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act as required by law. We plan to end around 12 o'clock p.m. Okay, so the purpose of today's meeting is to focus on the Executive Director Review process. This committee has been tasked with streamlining that process and ironing out procedures that the governing board can rely upon annually. To be clear, we will not be discussing the performance of the executive director. Such matters must be handled in closed session, and they are slated to be discussed at our next committee meeting and again at our February governing board meeting in closed session in compliance with Bagley-Keene. So I ask all commenters to keep this in mind during our meeting today and appreciate your attention to this matter. Before we dig into today's work, I wanted to take a look at what lies in front of us. In total, there are 7 agenda items for today. Our agenda, which is posted on the C2C website, specifically notes the agenda items on which we will be discussing and accepting public comment. Today, members will be voting on 1 agenda item, and we will open it up for member dialogue on 3 items. So in total, there will be 3 opportunities for the public to engage with the committee. Next slide. Okay, so now I'd like to call the meeting to order and ask that Mary Kay Cruz-Jones please call the roll.
Thank you. Member Avina? Member Moldoff?
Here.
Member Payne?
Here.
Member Tagorda?
Here.
Member Winkler?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. So we'll now move on to agenda item 2, overview and layout of the executive director process, including key milestones for the community in terms of background context. On August 9th, the governing board gave the authority to the Executive Director Review Committee to lead this process. A committee convened last year, and as mentioned earlier, it's the intent of this committee to streamline the review process. The office has partnered with Leading Resources Incorporated, or LRI, to help the committee work through this enormous task. So now I'd like to invite Jane Harrington from LRI to present this next agenda item.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robert. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, committee members. Good morning, C2C staff, and the members of the public joining us. Like Robert said, my name is Jane Harrington. I work with LRI, and we work with boards around governance, best practices, leadership, performance evaluation, and other matters. So for this first item, we're just going to talk about the overview and layout of the Executive Director Review process. And a staff report was prepared and posted on the C2C website that's going to capture in slightly more detail a lot of the information that we're getting ready to go over. So please refer to that on the website, and we'll move into this first item. So the annual performance review is actually in education code specific to C2C. So when C2C was created in education code section 10866, it noted that the board has the responsibility of hiring, evaluating, and terminating the executive director. So it's in statute. It also, from that, became a part of the governance manual. So the C2C governance manual states that yearly performance review of the executive director is a critical activity of the governing board, which is intended to support the executive director. So they intend to do that annually. Like Robert said, this committee is an ad hoc committee that was recently created, so it's not a standing committee, and it has a charter that has a number of activities. Those are also in a previous staff report, but For our purposes today, we'll focus on a few of those activities, including developing the process for the performance evaluation at this meeting, presenting a recommendation for the performance evaluation process to the board at the board's next full governing board meeting in November, considering a draft performance evaluation at the January meeting in a closed session. Like Robert said, those personnel matters are always in closed session, and presenting a recommendation for the draft performance evaluation to the board at the full board's next February governing board meeting, also in closed session. The meeting today has a few things we're going to get to. So we want to talk through the timeline of the review process, the period that the review will cover, so the performance period that we'll evaluate, the participants that we want to include in that evaluation process, how the process and specifically the survey is administered, so some of the kind of technical details around that, the content of the survey itself, so how the questions are presented, and then the rating scale for that survey. The next time this committee meets in January, we'll actually, based on our timeline, have the data. And so this committee will be able to review a summary of the data, discussion of the ratings and the examples provided, and discussion of the themes that came up in the data. I'll pause there and see if we have any questions from our members.
Thanks, Jane. It's important that we understand, obviously, for the members of the committee, the cadence of our upcoming meetings and what will be discussed to help us guide our discussions today. So members, before we close this agenda item, I'd just like to open it up to you. Do you have any questions, comments, or concerns just at a high level right now for Jane and what she's laid out so far? Okay, seeing none right now, let's move on to the next part here, onto agenda item number 3. This is the discussion, public comment, and possible action on executive director review survey and survey logistics. So now that we've had this overview, Jane, we'd like you to help us facilitate this next part as well. These details are going to be important for both members and the public to visualize how this process will evolve. And now that we have established a clear roadmap, Jane is going to walk us through the survey and important details related to the survey process.
Great, thank you, Robert. Again, as with the last item, a staff report was prepared. This is going to be a different staff report than the last item we discussed. So I'd like to refer members to the staff report that was drafted. Members of the public, again, it's on the C2C website, so you can follow along. I propose that we kind of hit everything at a high level. So I'm going to move through some of the details, and then we'll get to the very end, and then we'll go back and discuss everything. So I'm going to try and move us that way so that we can cover all of the content, make sure we're fully informed before we dig into our discussion. The discussion items are going to be the survey questions themselves, the rating scale, who those participants are going to be, and those logistics I mentioned on how we want to administer the survey. And we have a couple of choice points along the way. So the components of what we're calling the performance evaluation actually has a few things in it. The first one is going to be the survey, just like it sounds, asking how did the executive director do around this item? How did they perform around this item? Right? And that is for the governing board members. All governing board members will be looking at that, or the party responsible for that item. And that item is where we collect the data, but it's not really a final product. So it's not something that we would ever put in like a HR file, right? It's just it's a component of the review, but not a final deliverable of the review. We also asked the executive director themselves how they think they're doing, and we asked them the very same questions that we asked the governing board members. So that executive director, or the ED self-evaluation, the responsible party is the ED, and that does become part of the Cal HR file. The survey results. So you have the survey, you have the data that comes out of that survey, that raw data, that stays with the third-party consulting firm, right? So we hang on to we're responsible for that raw data, and we'll talk more about that. That raw data, again, not a deliverable, not kind of an outcome of the process, so that wouldn't go in your final file. The survey summary is where we capture the themes and the big takeaways. That's what gets shared out. Again, LRI responsible for that, not a final piece of it, so it doesn't go in the file. And then all of those things inform the performance review itself. And the chair and the chair-elect are responsible for writing that performance review based on what they get from the other components. That does go into the HR file. And then finally, the letter to Cal HR, the chair's responsible for that, and that goes into the HR file. You can move to the next slide. The performance review period for this coming survey is really based on the performance review period of the past one. And so the current executive director actually started with C2C in February of 2022. And so because they were trying to get an annual survey in and hit some timelines on that, last year they conducted their survey in November of 2022. So we're proposing that we pick up where that left off, so starting November, December 2022 through November 2023. That will be, as people are taking that survey and thinking about the performance, that will be the timeline that we're thinking of, because we want to time bound this and make sure we're just capturing what's happened in the past year. The timeline for the review process itself, if we're going to meet that November timeline and also work within the larger governing board's meeting schedules, we're right on schedule. We're kicking it off with this committee meeting. We'll reach out to the board. We'll present to the board at their next board meeting. The executive director's self-evaluation will be due so that it's available to the governing board members when they take that survey in November. At the end of November, we'll compile all of that data. We've got the chair some time in December to prepare that performance evaluation. We'll meet again as a committee in the new year, January 9th. The chair and the chair-elect will meet with the executive director, and then we'll present that presentation or present that recommendation to the governing board at the next full governing board meeting in February. All right, next slide. As I pointed out, we want to hear how the executive director thinks they performed and hear their reflections over the year. And so we have the executive director complete the same survey, and that survey or that performance review that the executive director does is available to the board members to review, to kind of help them reflect on what's happened in the past year before they actually take the survey.
Jane, I know we're about to get into the proposed survey questions, but before we do so, Jessica might have a question or.
Oh, thanks. Sorry, Jessica, yell it out. What you got?
Sure. I guess can you go back to the previous slide just for context?
Mhm.
So here I see that like the performance review is based primarily off of the survey, and then as well as the ED's personal review. But one thing, I guess my experience as a staff member of a commission with a different board, one thing that I've appreciated in the process that our commission has set out for executive director review is actually discussing with staff how the executive director is doing, because of course, like as governing board members, we know what the ED is doing in relationship with the board and with the public, but less so with the office. So I'm wondering if there's room in this timeline to maybe not have like a formal survey process, but potentially have the ability for like maybe Robert and like another member of this committee to meet with staff in order to get some of their feedback. And that could be feedback which could be compiled and then submitted to board members for the survey along with the ED self-evaluation.
Thank you, Jessica. Yes and yes, but Robert, do you want to address that first, or I can? Sure.
Yeah, it's a common concern, and I think is a warranted one as well. There might be a way to incorporate those sentiments exactly. Jane, do you have a sense of how we might incorporate staff input into the process if that's a desire of the committee?
If it's helpful, Robert and Jane, I can give you guys a little bit of the like legal limitations on what you can and can't do.
Okay.
So rank and file under Marianne cannot be part of like the staff review process. It would have to be the CEA level individuals, and there are 5 of us. And my recommendation, because the statute says the governing board shall evaluate, that the survey not be provided to CEA, but there could be a conversation that could then inform the draft performance evaluation. And it seems like based on the calendar, you could do that sometime between maybe during the same time of the survey period, but there's no reason why it would need to happen during that window. It could still be happening when LRA is preparing the summary of that, if it's only going to inform the December draft performance evaluation. But I would also suggest that if you are going to meet with CEA, that maybe there be a development of like standardized questions or things that you're going to ask for feedback on, just so that you're getting the same results from each CEA.
That makes sense.
Not the same results, but you're getting feedback on the same
with
areas.
Consistency. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jessica, does that address your feedback?
Yeah. No, and that does align with what we do here. Of course, I do know Julia. So I guess my only caveat for that would be, I guess as a governing board member, I would be interested in knowing that before completing the survey. Because I feel like, well, I guess, I don't know, like if the survey has components about the office, then it would be helpful to know that kind of review for individual board members to give feedback on. But if that timeline is unrealistic, then yeah, I think just incorporating that at the I guess for our January meeting, having that available would be helpful.
And Jessica, not that it's completely relevant, but at CSAC, they did not do the staff conversations prior to the survey, just so that you know.
Okay. Gotcha. I didn't know that was a survey, so good to know.
How did the rest of the how about other members on this topic, since this seems to be a pretty crucial point? Gavin?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. It is a crucial point, and I agree that direct reports are the only people that we should talk about or to talk to, because obviously they're direct reports, and I think this is an artful solution to adding that into the mix of our consideration.
Okay. Jerry, any thoughts from you?
And that would be in a closed session at some point during that time?
You mean the report out of what the results from the staff would be?
Well, yeah, for the discussion with those, you said 5 CEAs, Julia?
Yeah, there's 5 CEAs. I can tell you in past practice, it's typically been the chair or the chair and the vice chair, this does not have, that's not exactly relevant to this committee, but you could have two people from the committee meet with CEAs either individually, I would suggest perhaps individually, and then that would be discussed in closed session. But since the chair currently is responsible for preparing the performance evaluation, my recommendation would be that the chair participate in those conversations so that that can be integrated into the performance evaluation, which would then be discussed in closed session with this committee in
January, is that in January 9?
yes, exactly.
So then, as I'm processing, the timeline would be, it might be challenging to try to do the CEA conversations before or before the survey goes out to the governing board, right?
Agreed. And
had to-
I just wouldn't recommend that. I think you could do it simultaneously. You could do it between November 6th and December 4th or something like that.
So it'd be on parallel tracks, right? We're launching the survey with the governing board members. At the same time, the chair, that would be me, and another individual from our ad hoc committee would be engaging in one-on-one conversations. I would suggest one-on-one conversations, since that would probably generate the kind of feedback that we want. One-on-one conversations with the CEAs are at around roughly the same time, so that both can inform the development of the performance review. And then when we get back together on January 9, we would have a summary of the survey results, as well as feedback from the CEAs to help inform the process. And then I would report that as part of my deliverable to the committee. Does that sound like it captures where we're at? Julia, first of all, does that sound like it's a practice that would work from a legal or compliance standpoint?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. How about from the board? Does that work?
Yep, that sounds good.
Works for me.
How about LRI? Jane, do you think that would fit within our time frame?
Absolutely. I think it makes sense to do those on parallel paths. This is something we do see with other boards. They make different selections around this. I also have other boards that have staff engagement surveys, and I'm not sure if that's sort of in line for C2C's future, that can also kind of be something that the chair and the committee considers in the future.
Yeah, and I think maybe we'll go with this sort of one-on-one conversation for this time around.
Right. We don't have that available at this point, but maybe in the future.
Now, the one thing that we don't have at this particular juncture to discuss right now would be the kinds of questions that might be asked. I do agree that there should be consistency in the kinds of questions that are asked. Julia, just from your experience with other agencies, what do you have anything that can help inform that process?
The evaluation chair and vice chair did not share the questions that they were planning on asking with me as general counsel in my previous position. So I don't know what they asked. Jessica might have an idea if she happened to be one of the people interviewed. I don't know if she was. So I apologize, but I don't know. I wonder if LRI has
We have examples.
suggested questions, and you could just designate, if there's an action item regarding the process, you could just designate to the two people who participate in those to develop the questions that they're going to ask, if you're comfortable.
Well, maybe one thing we can do as we go through the survey questions would be to ask the governing board as well for just general thoughts on the types of questions that might be asked during the CEA conversations, right? So even if we don't pin that down in the same way as we do with the survey questions and the survey instrument, then we'll at least have a sense of what this ad hoc committee might want to see in that coming out of that process. Gavin, I saw your hand raised.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that that you could put together fairly easily with the examples from Jane and with the surveys questions themselves a pretty good sort of brief list of questions for the CEAs. One of the things I do want to bring up too, at least for us to have out there is that it's possible that a CEA may want to opt out of doing this process, and there should be no issues either way if a CEA does not want to participate in the process. It could be anything from timing to any other reason, and so we should be pretty cool with that.
Yeah, I concur. Jessica,
and
you
I-
have any thoughts?
Yeah, I will. Yeah, I will say that the questions are very broad. They're basically like kind of strengths, weaknesses, recommendations, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it wasn't anything like too detailed. But yeah, I think between Jane's comments and anything we can kind of flag that would be relevant in the survey would definitely be a good start.
Great.
Jerry, how about from you? Anything to kind of close out this conversation?
No, I think I agree. I think we're on board with the direction that we're headed. So
Okay, sounds good. So this is going to continue to develop as we go through the survey instrument. And now it's probably a good time for us to pivot to that portion of it. Jane, you want to continue?
Great discussion. All right. So we've talked through the executive director's self-review, and we'll move into the proposed survey questions. If anybody's taken any surveys recently, you know you don't love long surveys. So we really want to be very, very focused in our survey, both the topics and the actual questions. We have 9 topics that we focus on when we're looking at leadership, right? And so we've broken the survey up into those 9 topics with some customization for things that are really important to C2C's vision and mission. From that, we can break it down into 19 multiple choice questions, and then some open-ended questions at the end, like Jessica said, sort of the strengths, the weaknesses. I'm going to keep moving, and then we can sort of come back if we need to ask more detailed questions. So I kind of get through everything, and then we'll flip back and dig in. So that's the survey questions, and then the survey rating scale. We recommend using what the Cal HR performance reviews uses. So it should be familiar. It's basically exceeds, so the performance consistently exceeds expected standards, the performance fully meets expected standards, or improvement is needed for performance to meet those expected standards. Basically a 3-point Likert scale. I'd like to talk through some of the logistics now. The survey itself will be administered by the third party, right? There's good reasons to sort of keep it out of the organization itself. That's common when we do these. The platform we use is SurveyMonkey. The survey itself will be shared with all of the governing board members, right? So not just the folks on this committee, but all board members. Our goal is a 100% response rate. That means every single governing board member, because we know in statute and in your governance manual that that is the responsibility of the governing board. And so we want to take that responsibility very seriously. To do a 100% response rate requires that we know who's responded. And there's a recommended way of dealing with that. So we would want some sort of identifying information to be included so that we know which member has responded to that survey. We could ask in the survey for the respondent to include their name. They could just type in their name. And like I said before, that data is only coming to LRI. So we're using it to evaluate if everybody's responded. We're not connecting that name to the actual response. There's no value for us to do that in the data analysis. And then when we give that summary to C2C, all of that identifying information would be removed. So that would never be delivered in any product. That would be stay with LRI. One way to do it. The other way, SurveyMonkey has some limited functionality that will show us who has completed the survey. We have relied on this at clients' request in the past. It is a limited function. It will basically tell us if somebody has opened the survey, if they've started the survey, and if they've completed the survey, and I'm using air quotes around completed, meaning that they could open it and hit submit, and either accidentally or just to, satisfy the 100% response rate. So the internal functionality of SurveyMonkey is a little bit limited. It presents some other functionality issues too. So I'll keep moving. We can come back if there's, oh, Jessica, did you want to discuss now or do you want to discuss in a moment? Yep.
Yeah, just a really quick question. If there are any governing board members whose tenure did not, basically they weren't there for the entire time that we're asking about, because it is a looking backward thing. I guess, are there going to be options, I guess, in the survey for them to note that they don't know, or kind of to caveat the survey with the newness of particular members?
Yes, thank you for asking that. That will be one of the answer options. Is I think we had it worded as do not know, do not have information on that, something like that. So I can clarify that.
Great. Thank you.
Once the survey is completed, LRI takes all that raw data, right? So that's the multiple choice questions, but all those open-ended questions, right? Anything that people type there, we take that raw data, we analyze that, and we do share that data with the chair and the co-chair. Of course, like I said before, with that identifying information removed. We also prepare a summary. So instead of just everything, we go through and we look for themes in that data, particularly that open-ended response data. So representative quotes, things that we've heard multiple times. That's in that analysis piece. Go to the next slide. Again, the chair will prepare that performance review with the chair-elect, and the committee will meet, have that summary data, and committee will meet to discuss the review, and the chair and chair-elect present the review to the executive director. The board meets in closed session to review and adopt that recommendation. Your timeline would be February with that. And then the chair handles all of the kind of logistics with Cal HR. Let's see. We'll keep moving forward. All right.
Is there an opportunity for the executive director to respond to that review?
There is, so the chair and the chair-elect meet with the executive director to share that review. Are you asking specifically, and they have a conversation around that, right? If there's questions, if something is unclear, are you asking for more than that, Jerry?
Yeah, both actually. The conversation as well as maybe something in writing as a response.
Okay. I do have organizations that do that, but I'm going to defer to council on that question in terms of written responses to the or Robert, sorry, either.
Well, let me try to process as well what Jerry was asking for myself. So when the chair and the chair-elect meet with the executive director, the materials that are available for that discussion would be the evaluation itself, right? Or the draft of the evaluation, because this would be late January, after we've met with this ad hoc committee again, but before the meeting with the full board in closed session, right? So this would be a chair-elect, executive director conversation. At that point, there's a draft evaluation that encompasses the survey, summary from LRI, the CEA feedback, and then obviously observations from the chair that inform the evaluation. At that time, does the executive director receive a copy of the summary of the survey, or because it's not supposed to be in the evaluation file, there's nothing in there apart from what is summarized in the evaluation?
That's a little bit up to the committee to decide. There's nothing that would prohibit that. I would recommend against seeing individual survey results, but the actual survey summary, I don't see why that would be problematic to share in a discussion. That doesn't seem like a problem to me. And I have seen where there have been opportunities in surveys to provide like further explanation, especially if you have a really low or really high rating, just so that, you know, it provides more nuanced feedback to the executive director, which is helpful. They're not doing something that the board expects, or if you, Robert, see the survey results and are like, why did everybody rated them as a 4? Why did this one person rate her as a 2? If there's an explanation that, you know, can provide more context as you're trying to develop a draft performance evaluation.
Well, certainly one thing that we had discussed at the last round was for any needs improvement to have an opportunity or to require feedback from the reviewer as to why that rating was provided, right? So,
I mean, I think that feels like constructive feedback to me, because otherwise, how are you asking your executive director to improve?
Well, precisely, we encountered that is precisely the kind of situation we don't want, where a rating is assessed and there's no context that would enable improvement or continued high performance from the executive director, right? So let's ask that first to Jane. Jane, is that built in, that capability built in, that someone who rates needs improvement would be required to provide feedback as to why that rating was provided?
Yes, it is currently in the design itself. And Robert, to your point, we do it for both an exceed. So if this is a very high rating, we say, okay, well, what's the reasoning for that? And definitely if there's improvement needed, we do look for that. And so if they select either of those responses, it'll have the functionality, will pop up and request more information.
Gavin?
Oh, no. I was just doing a thumbs up, but I'm glad to comment as well. I think in the conversation with the executive director, we should have all of the materials available to us to engage in that conversation, to give and to sort of share evidence about what it is. And I think, to Jerry's point, that's a prime opportunity for the executive director to sort of take in that information and be able to share it and respond and give context themselves for whatever that sort of piece of data is.
I concur with that, because I think the idea that if we're summarizing raw data, right, whether it's CEA level or survey data from the governing board, it should be made available to the executive director and provided, even if it ultimately doesn't go into the Cal HR file. But it's important for the executive director to receive structured feedback on performance, particularly in very specific areas it's highlighted by the review protocols. I think the other question that Jerry raised, I'd like the group to consider is, okay, so now that that's been presented to the executive director in sometime in January, late January, is there an opportunity for the executive director to respond back, right? That was your question, Jerry? Yeah. So what do we think about right now? It doesn't seem to be explicitly contemplated in the process, but what do we think about that idea?
Can I ask a clarifying question? I guess my assumption is that the response back piece would be part of this engagement with the executive director sort of the back and forth with the executive director when we meet with her. Jerry, were you thinking more about a sort of a formal sort of written response that the executive director would prepare?
Yeah, exactly. I understand there's going to be a conversation between the chair and the executive director, but I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity for the executive director to write something in response that the rest of the board would see.
Jessica?
Oh, interesting.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say, I think that makes sense, and I imagine it may be because, since Jerry and I are both state people, so, given that, like, we're sort of modeling the scale off of state, there is certainly the precedence for performance reviews for people to respond and have that response in their file.
So the executive director would not be compelled to write something back, right, Jerry? It would be an option for and an
Yes.
explicitly stated option for the executive director to respond in writing should he or she decide that they want to exercise that option. And then that would be part of what gets presented in closed session in February to the full governing board, is what you're saying.
Yep.
Okay. Gavin, what's your thought?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's an option, yes, I think that's a workable solution.
Okay.
Not that there be a requirement.
Yeah. Jane, Julia, from your vantage points as third-party consultants and legal counsel, do you foresee any issues with doing something like that?
I don't see any issues, and I like that it lines up with what rank and file can do with their performance evaluations. So I think that's fine.
Jane, is that something that can get built in to the process?
Absolutely, very easily. And we do have organizations that do that.
Okay. So then we would probably want to provide some deadline, right, prior to the February board meeting that would be incorporated within that latter part of the process to ensure that there's that opportunity. So I like that. I mean, there's the self-reflection by the executive director that helps to inform the survey responses by the governing board and the entire process. It kicks off the entire process. And then having received the feedback at the end of the process, then the executive director has another opportunity to kind of reflect on this and respond in writing, should she or he elect to do so. Jerry, was that what you envisioned?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Okay. Fantastic. So are we now at a motion?
Can I jump
Go
in
ahead,
and
Jen.
say that I see the motion that is on the slide. I would say that we should add the key logistics as amended by the committee discussion to include CEA staff interviews and the opportunity for the executive director to provide a written response after the draft performance evaluation, if desired. And if you don't want to say those exact words, you can say, you know, so moved as amended by the general counsel or something like that.
So now, well, now is the time for us in particular to do this. Is there a motion?
So moved as amended by the general counsel.
Seconded.
I will type what I wrote into a document to provide for the minutes so that you guys have the exact motion, but it'll be very close to what I just said. So it'll capture it in substance.
Fantastic. Well, actually, before we go through a vote, were there any other choice points that let me see, were there any other choice points in terms of survey content, survey design, the response rate that's critical to the governing board? For example, the survey monkey having some limited functionalities, or do we want people to type in their name? Does anyone have any feedback on that you feel is critically important for us to consider before we actually move this motion forward?
Would the functionality, the tracking functionality, would that mean that you would have like personalized links so that you can track like which ones are opened, or is it just going to be a count?
It will let us track which ones are open, Jessica, and then which ones are submitted. So those are personalized links. The other limitation to that functionality is that it requires that all of our communication with the board goes through the SurveyMonkey platform, right? Instead of me or LRI or sending the board the links, we'd have to log into SurveyMonkey and put the email addresses in there and send it out. And we have had trouble with a few select state organizations before receiving emails from SurveyMonkey. So, and
Yeah,
that's just over.
This is the infamous, ends up in the spam folder bit, right?
Some of them block it. It never even makes it to spam. We are not sure how or why.
Jessica, Jerry, you have any thoughts on this? Because obviously we want 100% participation rate.
Yeah, well, I think then
I accidentally once upon a time authorized the blocking of SurveyMonkey.
Okay, now I know how and why. Thank you, Gavin.
there you go. No, I think then we probably should just have people enter in their names, because if we can't do that like exact level of tracking, then I mean, you could have someone attempt the survey 5 times and it makes you think that more people have responded.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, it is limited functionality. And like we said before, all of that identifying information stays with the third party, with us. It gets scrubbed.
Jerry?
I would agree.
Okay.
Names.
So I think it would be critical for us to frame the survey as exactly as you described it, Jane, where the personal identifiers are simply to ensure that the surveys are being completed, but they will not be included in the analysis. So part of that is going to be our framing during the November meeting when we discuss this process with the board. But there's also probably part of it that gets framed when we're communicating in whatever that email form looks like, with the governing board members.
For researchers, it's referred to as confidential, not anonymous.
Exactly. Thank you, Jessica.
So from just a managing to get to ourselves and in terms of a response rate, do we, and I'm just throwing this out there, I'm not actually suggesting this, but do we actually put something in the beginning of the survey that says, I have the survey, I choose not to participate, so that we don't have to continue pestering those people going forward? I'd hate to give people an out because we do want 100% participation, but has anybody done that before in any of their survey activities? Just like we want to give the option to CEAs to not participate as well.
That's a good question. Jessica, Jerry, thoughts on this?
I mean, my initial thought is that they can just respond, be like, don't know, don't have enough information to every question. But I guess I don't know. It depends on how easy you want it to be to.
Yeah, maybe that's the solution. Maybe we make it a little bit hard on them, but make them go through it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I
and
would
it does.
prefer to go that way.
Yeah. And it does sound like they could potentially just open the survey, put their name in, and then close it, and then be done. Like if none of the questions, I don't know, are the questions all going to be required of have an entry requirement?
We can make an entry requirement. Yes, that's a good design feature. You can just say, don't know, don't have enough information to get through the question.
Mm-hmm.
Jerry, I missed what you were saying there.
I was just going to agree with Jessica. I think we need to not have the option to not answer the survey, but have a don't know for each question or not applicable or something like that. But each question is required.
Got it. Yeah, that
Agree.
sounds fair. Yeah, that sounds fair. How about in terms of the procedures, the survey design, questions. Any feedback on those before we move to the motion?
Robert, I apologize. Let me go back just a couple seconds on this.
Mhm.
For clarity here, we're going to have the survey open for, let's say it's 2 weeks. I forget exactly what it is, but and we're getting down to the last few days, and LRI looks at it, and we have 3 people who haven't responded. Our understanding and what we've done with other organizations is to let someone in the organization know, if this is how you all want to do that, that these are the 3 people that have not responded. That's the purpose of the identifying information, so that maybe the chair could reach out to that individual. Is that correct?
I feel comfortable with that. I
Okay.
mean, this is part of our goal, right? And I feel comfortable with that only because this is such a critical function of the governing board, right? This is
Absolutely.
like, if there's nothing else that we do, it's this one. And so I feel that it's important for us to try to ensure that everyone responds. And I mean, we have enough guardrails here. All of the personal identifiers are scrubbed, right?
Hmm.
All of the, you have an opportunity just to put, I don't know, to everything. So we're not compelling people to say something that they don't believe. So I feel like that's probably okay. Unless any thoughts on that from the rest of the committee?
I would agree. Inform the chair and have them reach out directly to the organizations.
Yeah. Sounds good to me. Does that work for you, Jane?
That's great.
So maybe what we can do, this doesn't need to be reflected in the protocols, but internally, perhaps we'll have a particular date at which we're kind of checking and doing a dipstick on where's everyone at. And then at a certain point in time, it triggers a communication to me about who needs to be reached out to. Okay, Ben. Anything else from either our committee members or others on the call? In terms
So I'm looking at it again, and there are like gaps. Questions 16 through 19. It just says insert. Did we already go over that? Sorry if I missed it.
No, thank you, Jessica. And so this is kind of what I said about customization that's specific to C2C. And so you'll probably recognize a little bit of this here, but the C2C 5-year projected timeline outlines year 2 activities. And so as the board is evaluating the executive director, you could actually rely on that work plan and the executive director's self-evaluation for what they've accomplished on that work plan. And so for these, we would go in and insert what actually is in that work plan at a pretty high level. Sometimes your work plans can be pretty detailed. And so our recommendation would be that we just do 1 question for strategy and operations, 1 question for engagement, 1 question for analytical tools, and 1 question for operational tools. And that'll pull from your work plan. Does that sound right?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, we purposely left those open at this point to make sure that we're pulling from the appropriate work plan.
Okay.
The nice thing about that too is the survey year over year can be consistent in the other questions, and then those are the ones that would change out each year to get updated with your work plan.
And then, so are these questions more or less what was on the last survey, or are we like completely redoing everything?
So these questions combine I think what I would describe as the intent of your last survey, along with some best practices. So on our end, I might make some observations about the last surveys that you had a lot of compound questions. So you had some very, 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 very long questions. And so what we tried to do was tease those out to make sure that, okay, well, this is about the board, or this is about staff, or, you know, this is about, really, this is an operations question. And so you're going to see everything captured there, but maybe a little bit simpler and a little bit more focused.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
And then
Jessica, I had that very question, Jessica, and I did do a bit of a, you know, a crosswalk kind of process to just verify what was going on, and it matches by and large. It's just as Jane mentioned, simplified and made a little bit more discreet, I would say. So it's a sort of a version 2.0 of what we had last year.
okay, yeah, I was just wondering about to what degree we can see like improvement over if it will be comparable to the last survey. No, just thinking ahead. I also wanted to, since I'm in the the meeting materials, I've noticed that there was something posted, I guess a written comment that Marisol had mentioned about the questions. I wonder if we should address that here. I don't know, Robert, if you
Yes, that's great. Thank you so much. And I'm glad that you did bring that up right now. I'm trying to pull up exactly where it is. Let me see. If someone has it, please feel free to pull it up, because it might take me a little bit to just get it queued up.
I'll defer to C2C staff. I'm happy to share my screen right now if you'd like. You would just have to stop sharing for me to take over sharing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
And if helpful for folks at home following along, this is something that's posted on the C2C website. And it's listed as written comments provided by committee member Avina.
So just for members of the public, I'll just take a moment to read the bulk of the comments, because I think it's really critical for us to ensure that all of our committee members' ideas are captured for the record. I don't have any I don't have any comments on the process, Marisol writes, but I do have some comments / suggestions on the contents of the survey. As I look through the various elements in the survey, I feel that there's a gap on values-oriented questions, particularly on advancing racial equity. There's a lot of great competencies that are included in the survey, but I'm not sure I would have a sense of how the ED is doing in advancing equity through these questions. That would be an important thing for me as a board member to consider in assessing the performance of the leader of this entity. Secondly, during our last board conversation, if I remember correctly, someone brought up the suggestion of 360-degree reviews and was wondering if that was considered as part of the process, or if there are plans to consider this in the future. Let me ask our legal counsel about 360 reviews. Is that Julia?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd note 360 reviews aren't typically something that happens every year, and that we don't do 360. We can't do 360 reviews for rank and file. I don't know if Jane has any. So it's sort of, if we want to be equitable in terms of the process, allowing her to go through this performance evaluation, provide a feedback. I think that it makes a 360 a little bit problematic, and I wouldn't recommend doing it every year, but Jane might be able to provide more context on that as well, because I feel like we had some group discussions about that too.
Yeah, what we see for 360, usually we call it 360-degree feedback, where we ask everybody in the organization or a number of people that represent everybody in the organization to give some feedback for a leader so that they can change their style. And we use those in executive coaching quite a bit. And they're most valuable when they're conducted in conversations, so that it has context. And then there's somebody like an executive coach who can take that feedback and make it actionable with that leader. That's why we use 360 feedbacks in our work. And we also would not do them on an annual basis.
So it gets problematic because we can't have rank and file evaluating the exempt employee. We're a super small agency. So you're essentially, the pool of people you can talk to are the CEAs, and you're talking to them by getting
exactly
employee feedback. So
yeah, we wouldn't, we typically do 360 feedback as kind of one process, and the performance evaluation is a different process.
Gavin?
Yeah, so my recollection too is that, yeah, so having been on both sides of 360 reviews in the past, it's not necessarily a component of the performance evaluation process that happens sort of in the employer-employee relationship. It's much more of a sort of a coaching activity, at least in my experience. And the other thing that, if I remember correctly, in the board discussion, there was indeed discussion of this, but it was more along the lines of, let's do this every few years as opposed to on an annualized basis. And I think the number that comes to my mind, whether it's memory or it's just sort of practice in my head, is 5 years. And so I don't know that that's I'd feel pretty comfortable with sort of not engaging in a formal 360 right now for two reasons. The first is that we are actually going to be talking to the CEA, so that's a good thing. And the second is that I think there are no indications yet of sort of coaching that's necessary in terms of management yet. And I think that's, for me at least, one of the triggers that requires a 360. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, that does make sense. Jerry, Jessica, any thoughts on this before we move on?
No, that what Gavin says makes sense.
Makes sense to me as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think the fact that we've incorporated the CEA feedback in this helps to address some of the spirit, I think, of what a 360 might accomplish. Okay. Anything?
The equity question.
Oh yes, you're right. Thank you so much for that. That first part in there around equity. Thoughts from the committee members on how that might be incorporated?
I believe, isn't this one of the things we established in our strategic plan?
Yeah.
I feel like there was some mention of equity, so I wonder if it's going to be captured even indirectly in those insert questions that we talked about just a little bit ago. But I could definitely see, I don't know, I guess I referred to Jane of whether or not that would be sufficient, or if there might be some standard questions that could address this, because I know that equity is definitely one of the major values of the office.
And so question 13 in the current proposed survey questions addresses equity. So you do have a question on equity, and you will have the opportunity, respondents would have the opportunity both in that question and in the open-ended questions to give all feedback about equity that they'd like to give. Additionally, if this is a priority for the organization, and it is, then that's captured in your work plan and your strategic planning. And so those would be captured in the work plan questions. And you would have additional opportunities to give open-ended feedback there.
Certainly the CEA interviews, I feel very strongly about incorporating a question that relates to that, because I know that it's been a priority for the office overall, in addition to the entire office overall. So that in my view, is something that we should strongly consider as being included within that part of the process as well.
I guess I'm comfortable with that response.
Yeah, I am too.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else on this part of our agenda? So we talked about survey content, the design, the response rate, some of the procedures for the process. Are we ready for a motion?
I think we actually already have a motion.
Correct. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that. Are we ready for the vote?
Public comment?
Yep.
So we have a motion and a second. And now we are at public comment.
Perfect. I'd be happy to open up public comment at this time. So for members of the public that are joining us, please note that comments should be limited to agenda item 3. If there's anyone that's joining us via Zoom that would like to make a comment at this time, please raise your hand using the button at the bottom of the screen. And if we have more than 10 folks, which we don't have that many with us, we would limit comments to 1 minute, but it seems like we'll keep it at 2 minutes given the folks in the room. Scanning the audience to see if we have any hands raised. There are none at this time, so I'll give members of the public 1 more minute here, or a few seconds. Seeing no change in status, I'm happy to close public comment at this time. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now we have a motion and a second. We'll now ask Mary Kate to perform a roll call vote.
Member Avina? Member Moldoff?
Here, oh, aye.
Member Payne?
Aye.
Member Tagorda?
Aye.
Member Winkler?
Aye.
The motion passes with 4 ayes.
Very good. Moving on to agenda item 4. A review of the next steps in the executive director review process. Jane, can you please walk us through this next session?
There we go. And so at this point, we will take the edits from today and revise. We have a few edits. I'm not going to go through those, but just add some of those in, adjust the timeline slightly where we need to add a couple of deadlines and some of the recommendations. And so we will adjust that process and start to pull together the components of this review. So the next piece, as we've gone through, will be the survey. And we have that slated to launch in the very first week of November.
Thank you for sharing that information. Any questions from members regarding this? Okay, seeing none, we'll now move on to the next agenda item. Member questions and comments. So I appreciate all the information that's been discussed so far. So as we're wrapping up today, the next big decision point will be at our upcoming governing board meeting, where the board will be able to review the work of the committee today, and members will be able to adopt the survey, the process, and details that we've established during our deliberations. Are there any other additional questions or comments from members at this time? Okay, seeing none, We'll move on to agenda item number 5, which is on the next slide. General public comment. This section is reserved for general public comment. So Mary Kate, please walk us through this.
Sure, happy to open up here again for the folks in the room that are joining us. If anybody would like to make a comment, please raise your hand, your virtual hand. I'm not seeing any folks at this time with their hand raised. I'll give it another second. Seeing no change in status, we can close general public comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now future agenda items. During this agenda item, we'll open it up to members, followed by members of the public. At this time, folks can request items that they would like to see as future agenda items. Any thoughts from the committee? Oh, yes, Jessica, go for it.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess my only thought about what could potentially be a future item would be, when would we discuss whether or not this process worked? Because I know last time we tried to discuss it at the governing board meeting, which was, I think that happened. So I'm wondering if we're going to kind of embed a review either in this committee, or if it will be something that we discuss in the board meeting. I guess I don't know if that's going to be part of our January discussion or some other time.
That's a great point. Just an immediate natural thought to that would be for it to be scheduled in a board meeting after the February meeting that we have with the full governing board. And right now is probably not a time for discussion for this item. Is that correct, Julia? Am I allowed to invite comment on that suggested topic, or should we take it into consideration and then discuss it at a future time when it's appropriate?
I would take it into consideration and discuss at a future time.
Excellent, thank you. Other members? Okay, so seeing that there are none, we'll now move to open it up to the public. Mary Kate.
We will open it up for our final public comment period. So if there's any member of the public that would like to add future or make recommendations in terms of what future agenda items would be, please feel free to raise your hand at this time. As an update for our members, I see no hands raised, so I'll give folks another moment here. Seeing no change in status, I'm happy to close public comment on this agenda item.
Thank you. We'll now move on to agenda item 7, which is the adjournment. I want to thank everyone who joined us today, our members, for all their hard work and expertise and insights into this process, the thoughtfulness that we're approaching this, learning lessons from our last cycle to help inform the way that we move forward. I want to thank Jane and LRI for their facilitation, Mary Kate, Julia, the entire C2C team for their ongoing support of this process, and for the governing board. And also members of the public who continue to support the overall work of C2C. I want to make sure we always acknowledge those whom we serve. Our next committee meeting will take place on Wednesday, January 9th. At this time, we plan to host members in person. And of course, we'll invite any members of the public to join us at the Foundation for Community Colleges in Sacramento. For members of the public who would like to join virtually, that option would be available as well. We're going to hear more about this topic next at our upcoming governing board meeting on Wednesday, November 1st. And now I'd like to adjourn the meeting at 11:16 a.m. Thank you to everyone who
Thanks, Robert.
participated.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.